Guys, we need to talk about the madness of King George. The movie, not the actual mental illness of George William Frederick, King of Great Britain and Ireland, Elector of Hanover, who was probably suffering from porphyria, but, we can't be certain. So a couple of years ago, I was doing the thing where I would fall in love with an actor and then watch everything that they had ever been in, and at the time, it was Helen Mirren. Did you know she was in a version of Midsummer's Night Dream with Diana Rigg, and Judi Dench is there as Tatiana, and she's green, and no, this really exists, you have to watch it. So I got my hands on The Madness of King George because Helen Mirren was in the process of coming to play all of your queens. All of them. Now, imagine you're a props department and you need a historic-looking globe for a scene in which the bitter old King George III is complaining to William Pitt the Younger about the loss of the colonies, America, because the year is 1789 and Brexit is still fresh. So any old globe will do, right?
Apart from the place we mustn't mention. The colonies.
They're now called the United States, sir.
Oh look, another episode in which I talk about maps. That's what you wanted, right? Welcome to the first thrilling episode of Out of Time, the game show where I pedantically point out the temporal inconsistencies of the smallest of movie props. Let's take this chronologically, shall we? Okay. Tell me if you've heard this one. Napoleon, having realized that creating an empire takes a lot of moolah and having failed to re-enslave the newly independent island nation of Haiti, decides to sell the Louisiana Territory to pay for refocusing his efforts in Europe. Now, by this point, my historical boyfriend, you may have heard of him, his name was Alexander Hamilton. Well, he was living uptown in quiet disgrace and in less than a year would be dead, but he had managed, through the consolidation of individual states' debts into a national debt, the creation of a federally controlled national bank, and by pushing a pro-federal interpretation of the Constitution, to make the American market legit enough by 1803 that France was hitting us up for cash. In 20 years, Hamilton's economic plan had taken America from crippling war debt to money bags. Look, I had a crush on Alexander Hamilton before Lin-Manuel Miranda made it cool, okay? Anyway, Jefferson pays a cool $11+ million on top of the cancellation of some $3.75 million of debt we still owed France for the Louisiana Purchase. I mean, it was argued at the time that he completely overstepped the constitutional limitations of his presidential powers to authorize buying the whole shebang, but that's just par for the course when it comes to Jefferson. The man lived his life saying one thing and then doing the exact opposite in real life. I mean, sure, the Louisiana Purchase is considered one of the greatest moves of his presidency, which just goes to show that Jefferson always won, even when by his own philosophy he shouldn't have. What, me? Bitter? About Thomas Jefferson? Perish the thought. So there was this thing called the War of 1812. No one really agrees who won. America says we won, and Britain says they won. Canada says it was a draw except for the part where they won. But after the treaty was signed ending that fracas, the Treaty of 1818 was signed, otherwise known as the Convention Respecting Fisheries, Boundary, and the Restoration of Slaves. Yeah, so this treaty pays reparations for slaves freed during the War of 1812 because people suck. It also lays out the 49th parallel as the border between Canada and America until you hit the Rockies, and makes the Oregon Territory an Anglo free-for-all that Spain is no longer invited to. But we'll get back to that in a couple of decades. So this was also known as the Transcontinental Treaty, and was the work of then Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, soon to be 6th President of America, and my favorite son. So you're Spain, and you're sinking a lot of money into land wars in Europe. And Americans and British are running around Florida, which is your territory, but they're not there for something fun like Disney World. No, they're fighting the First Seminole War, and there's this guy named Andrew Jackson, and he's a dick. And then there's this other guy named John Quincy whatever, and he's like Secretary of State, and he was a big deal in Europe. Well, okay, more like his wife was a big deal in Europe. And he claims that fighting this war on Spanish-held territory is self-defense and okay according to international law. Can he do that? I don't care what he did in Russia. Can he do that? But that's not even your biggest problem in New Spain. No, your biggest problem in Mexico is fighting for their independence, and you really need to lock that down before it gets out of hand. What is it about this continent and independency? So you send your dude, Louis down east, to parley with John Quincy, whatever, except he's obnoxious and kind of unliked, and before you know it, you're handing over Florida and everything above the 42nd parallel to the Pacific Ocean, giving up on Oregon, but, I mean, you still have California, and you've negotiated the Sabine River as the border, but you're giving him the river rights, which is weird, because usually y'all split the river down the middle when it comes to borders. Needless to say, my boy Johnny Q, and a lot of historians afterwards, considered this act of hardball his single greatest contribution to American diplomacy. Side note, Mexico, once independent from Spain, would confirm the borders again in the Treaty of Limits in 1828. But that's the bonus. This treaty wasn't signed until 1842. So this treaty did a couple of things. It reaffirmed the border between America and Canada at the 49th parallel up to the Rockies, but it also cemented the border between Maine and Brunswick, which might not seem like a big deal, but inaccurate surveying is a big deal. There was almost a war. Well, okay, it was more like two neighbors fighting over a fence, except that fence was logging rights, and a pig might have been involved. It was an incident. But the tensions over what would be the line between Maine and Brunswick were high. People were combing archives for historic maps to back their claims. Daniel Webster found a map from the Baron von Steuben, and British Parliament combed their archives for George III's map, which then they kept on the down low, so it probably favored America. But then Jared Sparks found Franklin's map in Paris, where Franklin drew a big red line of what America's border was, which Daniel Webster then used for America's claim to Maine. That was really intense, you guys. Look, we were busy fighting a war with Mexico at the time, so we just agreed to extend the 49th parallel to the San Juan Strait and call it a day.
Goodness me. The United States.
Anyway, as you can see, the globe is clearly from the year 1846, and it should feel terrible.
The United States.
Now, some of you might point out that there were a lot more treaties than that, and yeah, there were. Nearly 500 were made with Native American tribes and were broken, many before the ink was even dried. But if I started listing all of those, I'd be here all week, and there is not enough tea in this world. Oh, well, look at the time. It's 1846, and Texas is still Tejas, so we don't have to go into that hot mess. Whew, saved by the anachronistic globe. So, the globe shows up for the first 13 minutes of the movie, and then is on screen for less than 5 seconds. I didn't ask to be made this way. Help. Shout out to my countrymen and super early adopters, BN12, Janice Archin, Alan, Captain Boogerbutt, Pfeiffer, Thighbutt Nicodeme, which I can't wait to find out how badly I flubbed that one, Matthew Abbott, Christina Tillman, Hillary Thomas, Amy Thorne, Gomer, Donald Kronos King, and the Nerdcore Cabaret. Thank you so much, and stay tuned till next time.